Thank you, Christina. And thank you to all of the conference organizers for giving me the opportunity to present here. I want to warn people ahead of time that there's a lot of movement in this slideshow, and I'm not sure how it will look across 3 large screens, one of which is especially large. So if you're prone to queasiness, you might want to cover your eyes at some points. So over the past decade, the term affordances has nestled itself into a comfortable position within video game theory, being adopted into the vocabulary of both academic game theorists and practicing game designers. Exact definitions of the term as it's used vary, but within a fairly predictable range. So a few examples we have here. The opportunities for action made available by an object or interface, what an object offers an organism to do with it, the functional input-output relationship of an object in the context of an environment. Now we can see some traces here of different theoretical backgrounds, with some borrowing the term directly from ecological psychology, as it was pioneered by James J. Gibson, others being more inspired perhaps by its use in HCI and experience design theory as filtered through the writings of Donald Norman. But despite these different backgrounds, everyone agrees that the term affordances provides a convenient shorthand, say, for discussing what sorts of environmental objects can be destroyed by this gun, or what sorts of objects can and cannot be picked up by this gun, or what sort of walls can and cannot have portals placed on them by this gun, or even what sort of blocks can and cannot be manipulated by this gun, for instance. And certainly, having a vocabulary for discussing these sorts of distinctions is very useful. But it also has the effect of shaving off some of the more interesting resonances of the term affordances within ecological psychology. So within the ecological approach to perception, affordances are profoundly bound up in issues of embodiment. Within the ecological approach, perception is defined not as an ability possessed by a given organism, but rather as a property of an organism-environment system, also known as an eco-niche. Within this system, affordances are dispositional properties of this synergetic organism-environment system. Features of the physical environment that is partition relevant to an animal's, or more aptly a species of animal's, capacity for activity. So in short, affordances are always in reference to specific bodily abilities of the actant in question. Now often there's this assumption within video game theory that affordances simply sort of jump out from the screen, presenting themselves self-evidently and directly to the player in an unproblematic fashion. But this split focus on the player and on the screen essentially bypasses the mediating figure of the avatar, the very body that fictionally is performing these in-game actions. And one could reasonably ask, why should we concern ourselves with this avatar's body? After all, video games throughout their history have long been inconsistent in their provision to the player of avatars that genuinely seem to possess bodies. So for instance, in 2D games from Super Mario to Super Meat Boy, is there a way to mute this very quickly? So from 2D games from Super Mario to Super Meat Boy, we've often been presented with avatars that can instantly cancel momentum, elaborately change direction of their jumps in midair, and generally are just more moving centers in space with no sense of weight or commitment to basic bodily action, and no sense they're capable of fatigue or strain. On the other side of things, in first-person shooters, for instance, these have so long fell prey to the sort of floating gun syndrome, in which there's really more of a feeling that we're controlling a mobile point of view more than a body. There's no wonder then that the discussion of affordances in the first-person shooter genre in particular gravitates towards guns rather than towards the bodies holding them, because guns are actually usually given a real sense of heft and actual differentiation between their strengths and their limitation in a way that the bodies, which are much more disposable and interchangeable, are not. So here I'm going to be focusing on the term within ecological psychology that complements affordances, which is effectivities. The definition of this is the causal propensities for an animal to affect or bring about a particular action. So as you can see, it forms a sort of fit with the definition of affordances. Objects in the environment afford activities, and organisms in the environment affect activities. What then are the benefits of borrowing this term? I believe there are two main opportunities presented here. Now, as we have just seen, not all, nor even most games, sustain the impression of controlling a truly embodied avatar. But exceptions to this trend do exist, and I'll be looking at several of them in this paper today. So when dealing with these exceptions, pairing the concept of affordances with that of effectivities allows us to better discuss the ways in which space in such games is thoroughly transformed by the bodily abilities of the player's in-game avatar. Secondly, the issue of how players are able to quickly learn and to recognize features of game environments in terms of the effectivities of the avatars they control is one that straddles two rich domains. On the one hand, it concerns practical issues of visual learning and conveyance within game design. On the other hand, it intersects with long-standing issues in the philosophy of game fictions, including the ontological fusion, between actual and fictional actions, and the relationship between user interface and game world. So my first example here will be Mirror's Edge. Mirror's Edge was released in 2008, sandwiched between the 2007 release of the first game in the Assassin's Creed series and the 2009 release of Sucker Punch's first infamous game. Given this pedigree, it seems to fit somewhat unproblematically into the genre of parkour-based 3D platforming that saw an explosion of popularity around the beginning of the seventh console generation cycle. However, looking to some of the writings of the game's most ardent admirers, we find some more far-flung descriptors, including both racing game and driving game. Now, Mirror's Edge focus on chase sequences, its time trials, and even the sort of giddy momentum that's provided by its first-person perspective on the world does a lot to explain this racing game designation. The driving game designation is a bit odder, and perhaps ultimately more telling. It moves towards the direction, Mirror's Edge perhaps moves towards the direction of vehicle games, perhaps precisely in the expectations that it places upon the player, to take complete responsibility for a unique set of movement capabilities that are grounded in the limitations of a consistent and decidedly non-cartoon physics. So unlike the distinctly slack controls of something like Assassin's Creed, in which the player only needs to hold down two buttons to enter into a free-running mode, in which case they can automatically jump over any gap, players really need to get a feel for how Faith, the player character within Mirror's Edge, sort of handles, much as you would with a vehicle in a driving game. Now, the game's first-person perspective is an additional complication here. In third-person parkour games, one can always easily gauge the height of objects relative to the avatar at a simple glance, and see available handholds, for instance, and the limbs that grab them at the same time. A first-person perspective presents different constraints. Now, there are several things that one can ascertain about a body, just given its perspective upon the world. For instance, in terrains with a visible explicit horizon, the horizon optically bisects objects on the eye level of the perceiver, specifying then this perceiver's height in relation to environmental objects. This is potentially useful within Mirror's Edge, but it's only really useful if we understand Faith's jumping and vaulting effectivities alongside her height and the height of objects relative towards her. For instance, recent study of parkour traceurs in ecological psychology has shown that they perceive walls to be shorter than the general population does. In short here, perceived height is scaled relative to anticipated ability. But most players picking up Mirror's Edge don't have a background in parkour. So how can the game offer a first-person view onto the optic flow of Faith's running, while simultaneously flavoring perceptual experience with Faith's knowledge about her own bodily effectivities? The solution that the game's developers DICE went for was runner vision, in which objects in the environment are recolored if Faith can use them to move beyond her current position. So for instance, pipes that she can successfully jump to, grates that she can successfully smash open and crawl into vents from, piles of boxes that she can successfully scramble up to reach an otherwise unreachable ledge, walls that she can run off of, and even ramps leading to walls that she can run off of, and any jumping off points on the rooftops of buildings that will safely land her onto another rooftop rather than splattered onto the ground below are colored a bright red. This serves to quickly communicate to the player the affordances in the environment that match Faith's effectivities. Now, runner vision expertly skewers the tired distinction between the diegetic and the non-diegetic within games. It penetrates the depicted space of the game, and it doesn't hang over it as an overlay, as a traditional HUD would. It also clings to objects like a fresh coat of paint, and especially some cues within the game, such as tags we see here, or even this PSA, which lists a fondness of color red as one of the warning signs that your child is a rooftop courier, sort of create some fictional cover for this interpretation, that perhaps what we're seeing is actually an indicator system that has been painted on within the game's fiction by other rooftop couriers. But this paint can be toggled on and off within the game's menu system. It also fades in and out of existence based on proximity. So details such as these puckishly jam the spokes of any attempt to pursue a tidy division between the game world and the game interface in this case. A more productive focus here, I think, is on the gap between player knowledge and skill and avatar knowledge and skill. Now, Rune Cleviar has characterized the player-avatar relationship as a progressive mapping between an actual learning process and a fictional learning process, writing that when the player has learned to time the jumps correctly, the avatar has learned to traverse dangerous pits. When the player fails to perform, the avatar fails to perform. When the player improves, the avatar improves. But the fictions of games can often conflict with this logic of progression mapping. If we look at something like Half-Life 2, the gravity gun is introduced to the player simultaneously with its introduction to the player character of Gordon Freeman. So this sort of encouragement on our part to play with the gun and to find out the range of its possible actions makes sense fictionally within the world. On the other hand, in something like Mirror's Edge, Faith's body is not an implement that she has recently picked up. It is something that she has lived in all her life, and we have every reason to believe, given her profession and her skills, that she knows how to use it. So I'm glossing here a bit. In my paper, I turn more to Jim Gee's thought here, in which I argue that although he's written insightfully about how expertise gets parceled out between players and avatars when he talks about what he calls joint professional identities, his narrow focus on certain forms of professional expertise creates some blind spots here. Knowing the scope and limits of one's bodily effectivities is, in fact, a skill in itself, and is distributed in games with different realms of responsibility, divvied to player and to avatar, much the same way as any other type of professional expertise that Gee looks at. Faith recognizes the things she can climb on within Mirror's Edge, and the player has to correctly time inputs to climb on these things. The game's solution to this is to literally color the player's perception, extending Faith's embodied knowledge outward into her world. So runner vision is effective, but it's admittedly also somewhat intrusive. But when the player is placed in control of such an unfamiliar range of movement effectivities, what other approaches would work here? To answer that, I'm going to look at a very different example. So quick note here in my discussion of Katamari Damacy. Although the body abilities of the prince character, which you're technically controlling, underline the movement of the Katamari itself, here I'll be focusing my analysis mainly on the Katamari rather than on the prince. Its constant changes in size and the game's forced constancy of its relative size on screen create this continuous rescaling effect of the game's environment, which is what I'm most interested in here. So, an example here. Here's a set of bleachers that appears early on in the game. When the diameter of your Katamari is under 14 centimeters, this first bleacher here can be rolled directly under. By the time you've reached a diameter of 25 centimeters, the bleachers now afford climbing, and they allow the player to roll up the entire set of them to access an area above. So, a quick note on some terminology here. Ecological psychology tends to push away from extrinsic or neutral measurements in favor of intrinsic and body-scale measurements when conducting research. So rather than use standard units, a popular alternative here are what are called pi numbers, which are unitless values determined by the ratios of A, that is animal properties, to E, environmental properties. Because of this constant change in the size of Katamari, the pi numbers of various obstacles within the game's landscapes are also in a constant state of flux. So turning back to this bleacher example, at a diameter of less than 14 centimeters, the bleacher height in pi number terms is 1.31. This indicates a rolling under affordance. At a diameter of 25 centimeters, on the other hand, the bleacher height in pi number terms is 0.73, indicating a climbing over rather than rolling under affordance. Much like Mirror's Edge, Katamari Damacy frequently requires players to move in ways that they might not have previously been used to. Constant changes in size require players to track gradual shifts in the way the game's spaces open up, close off, and generally provide a kaleidoscopic array of different movement affordances. And the game's Katamari-scaled visuals provide a quite elegant and deeply intuitive system for communicating these possibilities to players. Nothing quite throws this elegance into relief as much as those moments in which it breaks down. So to take another example, during the construction of the 7th star here, players encounter a fence that cannot be surmounted until the Katamari reaches 2 meters in diameter. And at this point, the fence's height in pi number terms is 0.53. This would seem to indicate a critical pi value of 0.53 for, let's call it, a fence-like obstacle vaulting affordance. However, if the player is still 2 meters at diameter, they will soon encounter a fence-like row of cones ahead that in pi number terms has a height of 0.48. However, this fence remains impassable until the Katamari is 3 meters in diameter, a violation of the critical pi value that was previously demonstrated. Now, in this case, the game's previously fairly consistent perceptual rules become overridden by an arbitrary design choice. And actually, this sign right here clearly indicates that you must be this tall to enter, reading 3 meters here. So that gives you a cue as a player that this is meant to be an obstacle that you can surmount once you've reached a specific size. However, it's sort of cheating the physics here, causes this row of cone to emanate a sort of vague aura of unfairness the first time you encounter it. So, wrapping up, game spaces are never neutral warehouses of polygons. They are always, to borrow a phrase from an oft-quoted passage in Merleau-Ponty's Structure of Behavior, pervaded with lines of force, delineated by the possible actions of the avatar in question. The effectivities of the avatar always open up and constrain the space of their respective games. Now, the concept of effectivities is more specialized than that of affordances, and so I'm under no illusion that it will gain as widespread adoption in game studies, nor potentially should it. However, it can be a very useful addition to our toolbox in games featuring more robustly embodied avatars. Some examples here, in addition to the two examined in depth, would be games, for instance, in which the player controls a character at different stages in their bodily growth, for instance, Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, or perhaps the beginning of Fallout 3, controlling your character as a baby. Also games in which players control a non-anthropomorphized animal or otherwise non-human avatar, both those in which players can transition between multiple bodies, such as Dishonored. There's a clip of possessing a rat in that game. And those in which the player consistently controls an animal, such as the recent Shelter. So here's an example of effectivities for taking cover under foliage in that game. Or, for instance, horror games that emphasize hiding, crawling, vaulting, and squeezing, such as the recent Outlast. Here's just a highlight reel of some of the actions the player character has to undertake in this. Knowing what objects are light enough to be pushed versus too heavy. Knowing what can be vaulted over, squeezed through, jumped on, etc. Often in very quick chase sequences, such as this. In games such as these, the space of the game world is shaped and crafted by avatars' bodies in terms of the knowledge parceled out between player and player character about these bodies' skills to such a degree that it would be incoherent to separate them. So we could say, in effect, that these avatars are their game worlds existingly. Thank you.
No questions?
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting presentation, and your last comment. I would also agree with that in certain these genres of games, the avatar body is indeed the game. It kind of has incorporated the whole the whole game in itself, in a sense. But I'm going to ask a kind of sort of market question, in a sense, in terms of people's tastes, because this dominant thing of optimizing the corporeality of the avatar as a kind of floating thing that you talked about, optimized for shooting and combat. It seems to be enormously, has an extremely wide appeal and extremely popular. Because people like shooting, they like vehicles, and it's very kind of vehicular. It's almost like driving or have a gun on some sort of machine, and it's also quite similar to a kind of Steadicam thing. So there's a cinema thing it's a winning formula. But as far as I know, Mirror's Edge is not gonna be any follow-ups.
Actually, that's not true.
Okay.
EA has recently announced a sequel for it.
Okay.
There's very little information.
Yeah. My question was, what would you speculate about? The future for these more kind of body naturalistically inspired games, where you
Actually,
and potentials. Yeah.
I have a potentially unintuitive point. Is that I think actually a lot of what the sort of emergence of the body, especially in first-person games, I think a lot of that actually has to do with the popularity of first-person shooters moving to consoles and moving to gamepads in particular. I think the sort of Quake style is the most disembodied style of first-person shooter, and the one in which you're really just moving a camera. You're really just presenting transformations of space with any feeling that there's weight behind this. And you wouldn't want weight behind this because its distinctive feature is that it's incredibly fast. You have to know how to do lots of things with your left hand at once so that you can jump strafe and jump crouch and all of these highly effective tools for highly competitive players that nonetheless just completely rip apart the illusion even more that you're actually controlling some sort of bipedal creature. I actually feel that in the move to the more sluggish console control, that sort of opened up the opportunity for these sort of things. Designers had to deal with sluggishness in some way, and one way to deal with it was to actually start invoking bodies and the ways in which bodies are themselves sluggish. So I think you see interesting things like Titanfall, which is coming out, which has some similarities to something like Mirror's Edge. It's positioned as a fast-paced first-person shooter, highly competitive, something that will be, the defining highly competitive, fast-paced first-person shooter in the next console generation. And yet it's noticeably slower, and your options for movement are noticeably more embodied. There's a lot more running up of walls, sort of scrambling up things. If you watch not only players playing it from their perspective, but the models of other players that are playing it, there's a very real intention here to create sort of animations with weight to them. And I feel that is just something that designers grappled onto because they had to do something with the sluggishness that they were presented. They knew that they couldn't sort of pursue the old style of just doing super fast cameras hurtling through corridors, basically. So I think that sort of actually opened up the opportunity for this. And I think that because of that, we may continue to see more acknowledgement of bodies. I'm thinking particularly of the way in which the new Call of Duty was sold as you're no longer just a gun, you have a hand, it has hair, there's dirt between your fingernails, each individual particle of dirt is individually rendered. I think there's an idea here to sell bodies as something we want to see and want to think about, perhaps only because designers are now they have to accept this sluggishness, and so they might as well find a fictional conceit to wrap around it. And embodiment is a very good physical conceit for that, because our bodies are much slower than Quake.
Okay, any other questions? Or else I'll have a question if chairs are allowed to ask. I think it was a very interesting talk. Thank you very much for that. I'm just wondering, to what degree do you think that your approach also applies to third-person perspective games?
It's something that I do apply more to third-person games in the larger chapter that this is a part of. It's something that I ask myself how much, especially dealing with ecological psychology, so much of it is based on, basically on the first person. Like, what do bodies know about themselves by looking on the world and not, obviously looking at themselves from a non-egocentric position. I do find ways to get around that. I mean, I get around that somewhat in the Katamari discussion itself, although that's odd for a number of reasons. But I do talk extensively about differences between different third-person games, and I don't know that I'm entirely comfortable with defending that, but I do it anyway because it seems really useful. So it's, the defense of it is something that's still in progress.
Any other questions?
Thanks for the very interesting presentation. I was thinking about your examples of Mirror's Edge and Assassin's Creed. You didn't talk much about the latter, but I was thinking of my own experiences with those games and my frustration with Mirror's Edge when trying to play it and failing. And then playing Assassin's Creed, which kind of affords similar kind of experiences of traversing space, parkour style, where when I fail to make a jump or fall from somewhere, I don't feel it to be my fault, but part of the avatar's kind of failure, or maybe the game mechanism failure of not following what I wanted to happen. But in Mirror's Edge, I distinctly feel responsible for the failures I make. So would this kind of experience, do you think this is due to the experience of embodiment and the way you kind of presented this, or is one simply better designed as a game?
I wouldn't make any claims about which are better designed. I do think there are scales in which you can kind of place platforming. For instance, scales of commitment. To what degree do you have to commit to something after you've pressed a button? If you look at many of the 3D platformers, especially in the Mario 64 era, when everyone was making mascot players, there's a real expectation that after you hit the jump button, you can always pull the analog stick back or push back on the D-pad and effectively take back that jump and do things very carefully. And you have to be quick to take back things, but the game allows you to not commit to something versus something like Tomb Raider or something more modern like Mirror's Edge. Once you leave the ground, you are stuck with that momentum and you have to commit to it. There's also sort of this scale of what you're talking about, responsibility. When I fail in Assassin's Creed, I feel like it's because of the controls, but that's partly because when I succeed in Assassin's Creed, I feel like it's because the game's just running without me and I don't have to do anything. So I understand completely that feeling of feeling like yourself that you in some ways have failed the game in Mirror's Edge, where feeling, on the other hand, that the game or the game's controls have somehow failed you, because it builds up this expectation of you not having to do much, which gives you very little feedback then for why you didn't make a particular jump when it occasionally happens in Assassin's Creed. The relative sponginess, commitment, and those slackness of controls, I think, have a very large effect on how much we connect to these bodies and the way in which we connect to these bodies, and if we connect to these bodies at all, or if we just connect more to a controller, which for me feels like the case in something like Super Meat Boy. That's more of a virtuosic movement of analog sticks and buttons for me. And by the end, I don't even see Meat Boy as a point in space. I just kind of see the entire frame shifting and knowing how to move the analog sticks accordingly. So yeah, I would say that those are different sort of philosophies towards design, and they can be critiqued on their own individual merits. I'm more interested in sort of teasing out the differences, which you have started to do, and I pursue some in the chapter version of this. More interested in doing that than just ranking them as far as game design goes.